Now, I'm going to come back to both of those, but first, I want to put a number on why this matters specifically to you. You see, the cost of water infrastructure needed for the AI build-out, you have treatment plants, pipelines, permits, it runs into tens of billions of dollars. And that money comes from municipal budgets, which means it comes from your taxes and your utility rates. In Virginia, for example, residential electricity bills have already gone up by about $16 a month just to fund data center power infrastructure. Water bills in several data center corridors are next. And if your retirement savings sit in a default 401k or workplace pension, and for most of you watching, they probably do, you're already financing this build out through your investments in index funds that finances these AI companies. And so the water that these facilities consume isn't just an environmental issue. It's a line item on your bills, and it's a risk that's sitting in your retirement account, whether you know it's there or not. Now, earlier I told you that there was an equation, so let me show you exactly what it says. Right, so we'll do this from scratch and build a vocabulary first, because there are too many people who use these words loosely, and that looseness is where the confusion lives. A watt is a joule per second. It's basically a rate. It tells you how fast energy is moving, not how much energy you have. So a gigawatt is a billion of those every second continuously. And when we talk about IT load, that's the electrical power that's actually consumed by the computing equipment itself. So servers, GPUs, storage, networking gear, as opposed to the power that's consumed by everything else that keeps the building running. So things like cooling fans, pumps, chillers, lighting, and power conversion losses. And when a data center operator talks about cooling load, they mean exactly one thing. It's the rate at which heat has to be carried out of the building. And what makes data centers different from a lot of other industrial facilities is the cooling load pretty much equals the electrical load. And so let me walk you through a real example, and I'm going to use a theoretical data center with about 500 megawatts of IT load. Is that big? Not particularly, because companies like Google and Microsoft are building facilities that are much larger than that size right now. But it's a clean number and it makes the arithmetic easy to follow. And so step one is the conservation of energy. You see, every single watt of electricity that enters a data center becomes heat. That is not a design choice. It's not a failure of engineering. It's just thermodynamics. The electricity goes in as electrons. The computation produces heat. There is no exit where useful work leaves the building in any other form. It's all heat. And so our cooling load, which I described earlier, we call that Q, equals our electrical load, and we'll call that P. That's the whole of step one. Step two, we have to define the latent heat of vaporization. Now, when water evaporates, so when it changes from liquid to vapor, it absorbs a fixed quantity of energy from whatever it's in contact with. And that's how, for example, your body cools down when you sweat. The water on your skin isn't just carrying heat away, it's absorbing a fixed amount of energy in the act of changing phase from liquid to vapor. And that fixed amount is called the latent heat of vaporization. And this value changes with the temperature of the liquid. Data center cooling towers will evaporate water at ambient environmental temperatures, which for the purpose of this video, we can take to be about 25 degrees Celsius. The latent heat of vaporization of water at this temperature is 2,442 kilojoules per kilogram. And so we move to step three, which is the equation. The mass flow rate of water that you need to evaporate equals the heat that you need to reject divided by the latent heat of vaporization. This statement is represented in the equation that you see on your screen right now. 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts, and 1 kilowatt is 1 kilojoule per second. So 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilojoules per second. We stated that our latent heat of vaporization is 2,442 kilojoules per kilogram. And so for 1 megawatt, the mass flow rate equals 1,000 kilojoules per second divided by 2,442 kilojoules per kilogram. Watch the units cancel. Kilojoules on top, kilojoules on the bottom, gone. You are left with kilograms per second. So that means that your mass flow rate is now 0.41 kilograms per second per megawatt of heat rejected, or 0.41 kilogram per second times 86,400 seconds per day, which is circa 35,400 liters per day, or approximately 9,352 gallons per megawatt. That is the thermodynamic ceiling. A 1 megawatt heat load at perfect evaporative cooling efficiency evaporates 0.41 kilograms of water every single second it is running. If we take the typical hypothetical 500 megawatt data center I mentioned above, the mass flow rate becomes 205 kilograms per second, or roughly 4.7 million US gallons per day. Now, real-world systems don't operate at this theoretical ceiling. Actual cooling systems are part latent, but they're also part sensible. That is, some of the heat leaves through evaporation, and some just leaves as warmed air or warmed water without a phase change. This is also known as sensible heat transfer. And also, the IT load that a company reports isn't identical to the total heat that the whole facility rejects. And so the typical range across the industry is about 1,800 to 2,900 liters per megawatt hour of IT load, depending on ambient temperature, humidity, and how the system is actually designed. But there are best-in-class systems that use less, with values of about 1,000 liters per megawatt hour. So let's use this value. Our 500 megawatt data center runs continuously, 24 hours a day. So 500 megawatt times 24 hours equals 12,000 megawatt hours per day. 12,000 megawatt hours per day times 1,000 liters per megawatt hour equals 12 million liters per day. If you convert to US gallons at approximately 3.79 liters per gallon, it's roughly 3.2 million gallons of cooling water per day from one facility. And here's the part that sustainability reports vary. Up to 85% of that water evaporates and it never returns to the local water systems. It's just gone. It becomes atmospheric moisture somewhere else. Now, before the sharp-eyed viewers head to the comments to tell me that I'm wrong, yes, all these numbers depend on climate, design choices, and how much of the cooling is evaporative versus mechanical. The range does matter, but it will never be zero. And here's what I promised you at the start of this video. You now have everything that you need to fact check any data center water headline. What you do is you take the facility's power capacity in megawatts and you multiply it by 9,400 gallons per day, or about 10,000 gallons for a quick and easy calculation, to get the thermodynamic ceiling. Now, note, like I just said, that real-world facilities typically land between 40 and 75% of that, depending on design and climate. And so if the published number is well below that range, you have to raise an eyebrow and ask them what they're not counting. For some further context, let me tell you what that kind of water consumption looks like in practice. Google's data center in the Dalles, Oregon, consumed about 550 million gallons, or roughly 1.5 million gallons per day in 2025. And this was about 40% of that small city's total water supply. When the Oregonian, which was a newspaper, tried to get the actual usage figures through a public records request, the city of the Dalles sued the newspaper to keep Google's numbers secret. Now, this is the part of the video where I ask if you have so far received any decent value from watching this video, to please subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps small channels like mine. And now, if you follow the tech industry, you most likely have heard about liquid cooling and how it's going to solve all of this problem, right? But I need to show you exactly what that claim is and isn't doing. You see, when NVIDIA talks about liquid-cooled Blackwell racks, or when you hear about direct-to-chip liquid cooling, or when Google says that one of their facilities uses closed-loop cooling, what they're describing is the coolant circuit. It means that the fluid that touches the chips is recirculated, nothing evaporates, and it doesn't mix with local water. So, problem is solved, eh? except closed loop does not say anything about where the heat that loop picks up goes. Here's the thing. The coolant loop absorbs heat from the chips and carries it somewhere. And that somewhere is either a cooling water, which evaporates water, or a dry cooler and chiller, which consumes electricity. Liquid cooling doesn't eliminate heat rejection. It is more efficient at getting the heat to the rejection system. However, it doesn't change the fundamental equation. And so, when a data center operator tells you that their facility uses dramatically less water on site, you need to ask them the follow-up question that they'd probably rather you didn't. Where did that water go and what replaced it? In most cases, the honest answer is going to be electricity via dry coolers or chillers. And now, this next bit is fascinating because what happens to the water when you replace evaporative cooling with chillers might actually make the problem larger and not smaller. And in order to understand why, we need to follow the electricity. You see, when a data switches from wet cooling towers to dry cooling, their on-site water use drops dramatically, and some hyperscalers report this as evidence that their facilities are becoming more sustainable. But dry cooling isn't free. Running chillers and mechanical coolers rather than evaporatively cooling your data center requires significantly more electricity, and that electricity has to come from somewhere. In the United States, electricity generation has historically averaged around 15 gallons of water withdrawn per kilowatt hour, although it has recently dropped to just about 12 gallons per kilowatt hour, and roughly 0.47 gallons actually consumed, meaning it doesn't return to the source.